I'm the Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons based in The Hague for the last 3 years. I have a background of diplomacy. I've been in several positions in the past as a Turkish diplomat, as ambassador in Israel, NATO, and a permanent representative to the United Nations. Before I took over in 2010 the position of Director General of this organization. This organization, in fact, I'm not going to make a full speech, but I just want to make some introductory remarks and open the floor for your possible questions. Since I think you came here, you may know a little about the organization, but still this was established in 1997 to monitor the implementation of a convention which was negotiated for 20 years, more than 20 years in Geneva. And the international community, in fact, decided finally to get rid of those weapons, which were massively used, as you know, in 1915 during the First World War. So there are several reasons which produced this. Of course, one of them is the end of the Cold War. And this convention, in fact, is seen as the primary peace dividends as a result of the end of the Cold War. To my satisfaction, the implementation of the convention was quite successful over the past 16 years. Over 80% of declared chemical weapons were destroyed. 3 countries have already completed, 4 others are continuing to destroy, especially the United States and the Russian Federation have possessed large stocks of chemical weapons which were never used but produced in the years in the 1940s. And now the United States reached a level of 90% and Russian Federation 74%. They spent quite enormous resources to do it because this is a very costly, labor-intensive, and hazardous operation. And in each facilities which have to be built next to the storage sites, about 1,000 staff are working. US, just to give you an idea, spent so far $25 billion, and they plan to spend another $10 billion before they complete the destruction. And it's going to happen soon, in the next 4 or 5 years. Therefore, we need to prepare the organization for the post-destruction phase. We want to focus more on our non-proliferation activities, verification of industrial sites which produce or handle dual-use chemical materials. We want to make more efficient and effective the data monitoring, transfer controls, export-import controls of dual-use chemical. And also to deepen our activities in the field of assistance and protection. Each country, member country, has the right to ask the assistance of the technical secretariat, ours, as well as the assistance and support of other state parties in case they feel a threat of use or if they are subject, of course, to the use of chemical weapons. So that requires a lot of preparations, readiness, and we build some capacities in individual countries, but also we promote the regional or sub-regional preparedness. We also support the peaceful use of chemistry, and we hold several activities each year, especially with participants coming from developing countries. And this is well received by those countries which have nothing to declare in terms of chemical weapons nor industrial sites, but they are interested in the implementation of the convention, so we want to keep them engaged. With regard to membership, we have been quite successful. There are already 189 states parties. Recently, Somalia has become a new member. 7 countries are missing. In Africa, it's Angola and South Sudan. In the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, and Syria. And in Asia, it's North Korea and Myanmar. So we will keep our efforts to get them on board. And the case of Syria, of course, is extremely important in view of the reports of use of chemical weapons in this country. And the Secretary General, in fact, already invoked the mechanism of investigation, and he asked our support as the organization, the only international organization, in fact, which have the expertise to provide support for effect-finding mission. Unfortunately, this team could not be deployed because there was no agreement about the scope of investigation, and the team is collecting information from other sources. So that's where we stand, and we have a scientific advisory board. We have to follow closely the scientific and technological developments in order to be up to date, especially when they are relevant to our verification mechanism. And speaking about relevance, we want, of course, to maintain the relevance of our organization in the coming years, even if we once get rid of the existing chemical weapons. So we are planning to undertake some activities, especially in the field of education outreach, raising awareness about the Chemical Weapons Convention and its obligation among academia, scientific communities, students, and so on. And also we want to develop a center, training center in The Hague within the technical sector, so that we can preserve this knowledge and expertise for protective purposes in the coming years. I'm going to stop here. If you have questions, I'm ready to answer them. If you have views, I'm ready to listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Does anybody have any questions?
I guess.
Daniel, maybe you can identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm a researcher here in the Information Security Group in Computer Science, but I'm working on a very big EU project at the moment. The aim is to bring several institutes together from across Europe to understand how to analyze the security of buildings. And so we have groups that specialize in chemical attacks, biological attacks, cyber attacks, explosives. The idea is to try and bring all of these together and try and communicate using one language as opposed to separate. And from my perspective, I've learned a lot about various types of attacks. And I think one of the things that's most scary for me is the idea that a group of people can create or could possibly create biological attacks that have huge economic impact. And I guess my question is, could the same types of small groups of people generate enough chemical weaponry to have a global impact, or does it require governmental size groups? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
No, actually, generally speaking, the danger or the risks of chemical warfare between states has significantly declined, and I think these kind of scenarios have become quite remote in view of the development of security perceptions, threats. But still, the case of Syria is very special, and there are reports that North Korea also possess chemical weapons. Whether they are going to be used or not extensively, that's another problem. But the possible use of chemical weapons by non-state actors, in particular terrorists, is very much in the mind of member countries and their relevant authorities, and they want to be prepared, in fact, for an effective emergency response if they are used. So they hold several training activities at a national basis, and they ask, if necessary, our support. We send experts, and we teach them how to use protective gears, how to identify the possible substances that might be used, because the protection or in fact treatment of may change from one substance to another, and in fact it has to be identified first, otherwise there can be more complications. This kind of response capability or response capacity building activities are extremely important, and I see your point, in fact, is in this connection. I believe that we need to be prepared both for chemical as well as biological. In terms of protection and against chemical weapons, now the technology is quite generous. I attended an exhibition, a conference, and in the margins there was an exhibition in Stockholm on Monday, and I think the what the private companies are offering is quite numerous and very rich, and there is quite a important competition also. So the technology has grown, and we have more means now to protect our people, civilians, but still it requires a lot of training, to learn how to use those equipment and so on. The armies, of course, do have their own training, but for the protection of civilians, we have to develop some mechanisms, and they need to be effective. This applies also to my organization in terms of preparedness to emergency response. We have to work more closely with other international organizations which are relevant, like, for instance, the WHO, World Health Organization, based in Geneva. And in the latest, in fact, episodes regarding Syria, we had to put together our experts as well as the WHO experts so that they could work together. And if the team was deployed, of course, this would require a lot of interoperability capability, because in many instances you think that you are individually, separately prepared for this kind of scenarios, but when you bring together different institutions, different experts from different organizations, then you find out that the preparedness, in fact, was not ideal. Therefore, we want to, for instance, to hold some joint exercises in the future, in the coming months and years, so that we can serve our members in a more effective way. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Please identify yourself.
My name is Sally Leavesley. My field is catastrophic risk. I'm a visitor to UCL for this meeting. But I work with scientists around the world on looking at global threats from this and from other incidents. What I was going to ask, there are three small unconnected elements that are a bit of a puzzle at the moment. In relation to Syria, is there any concern about post-mortem effects on blood when trying to differentiate whether sarin has been used? Because one of the big problems is looking at the use of precursors of sarin, such as pesticides, and differentiating the effects in people who have been exposed. And I can see the differentiation that in the top chemical laboratories to identify sarin, but I was wondering if there are post-mortem effects that start to create a problem with this.
First of all, let me say that it may be relevant to you. We have also a standing agreement with the UN OCHA, in fact, because we realize that we will have to work with institutions, organizations like UN OCHA when we are faced with major incidents. In the case of Syria, this team, in fact, which works independently, so we don't interfere with their work. It's headed by scientists from Sweden, and he was involved in investigation missions in Iraq, so he has some experience on these issues. And they couldn't have access, as I told earlier, to Syria, so they were not able to collect samples, neither environmental nor biosamples, in fact, which include the post-mortem tissue or other samples, and they couldn't collect and therefore not analyze. But we know that some countries did obtain some samples and analyzed them, and according to their findings, we understand that they found some traces of sarin, which cannot be used as an evidence by this team, because there's the principle and, in fact, procedural provision of chain of custody. and which means that the samples have to be collected by the investigators, by the fact-finding team themselves, and keep them attended anytime until they are delivered to designated laboratories where these samples could be analyzed, and the results only would be provided according to an arrangement made earlier to the investigation team itself. So all these procedures are not in place at the moment, and they collect this kind of information as as leads or as some supplementary information, source of data, but in order to have a clear evidence, this chain of custody has to be in place. On technicalities that you mentioned, symptoms and so on, as I see it from different sources, there are different reports which sometimes, in fact, give an indication of the use of sarin, but which sometimes, as I understand, I'm not an expert on all those matters, but our experts suggest that they don't really indicate of the use of sarin, depending on the incidence. Therefore, I think the questions about the use of sarin and possibly other weapons in Syria will have to be addressed, in the coming days and weeks. And there's a Geneva conference, in fact, which is planned to be held soon. And I hope that the chemical weapons issue also will be addressed in this context, not only in relation to allegations of use, but the larger issue of the possession of chemical weapons in Syria, which reportedly amount to 1,000 metric tons of all varieties of chemical weapons and delivery means. And this is an important stock, and it may inflict, considerable damage.
Can I then go on just onto the second discussion point, which picks up the first one that
Yes.
was made, and that is the asymmetric group's use of chemicals as weapons. On June the 4th, it was reported from Baghdad that there had been a laboratory find by Al-Qaeda in Iraq,
Yes.
who linked with al-Nusra through into Syria, and that the intent or the activity was the production of mustard and sarin. In terms of that, and also with the threat from Syria of such quantities that may also get into hands of asymmetric groups, is there an active program to start to plan how to set up a whole structure for the identification and management of asymmetric group threats, and possibly communication and dialogue with them as well, in terms of the way the Convention wishes things to go?
Actually, the OPCW, in fact, is not a law enforcement organization, as you know, but in terms of direct contacts with non-state actors, we didn't have. We have a mandate, in fact, to have all our cooperation with certain authorities already identified as focal points for the OPCW, and it varies from one country to another. These are called national authorities, and they have the task, in fact, to coordinate the implementation of the convention among different agencies. As a matter of principle, we contact with them, and even if they're, in certain countries, their civil society is involved, they contact the OPCW through national authorities in general. We have also some direct contacts, but not in the sense that you just mentioned. This question, in fact, was raised with me whether small groups would have the capacity to produce chemical weapons, toxic chemicals. It happened, as you know, in the past, in 1995 in Tokyo, when Shinrikyo produced sarin, and they used it in a very primitive way, but still they were able to kill 13 people and injure several hundreds of them. So that this kind of use, in fact, is to prevent. In terms of prevention, of course, it's. I mean, we have no capability to help state parties. I think it will be up to state parties and close cooperation between them, intelligence and others, to prevent such, incidents. But our measures, in principle, I mean, the export-import controls, prevention of access to dual-use chemical materials which might be used for the production of chemical weapons, in general, do help prevent the access, and we hope also to get into certain new areas which we didn't deal with in the future on chemical security. For instance, the distribution of dual-use chemicals in particular countries. So I think they have to be controlled quite strictly by those authorities which deal with it. But we will be prepared, I hope, in the future to assist those countries, as we do, for instance, in training customs authorities and so on, and we will try to assist the countries in general.
Any other questions?
Yes, so I'm just looking at the news here, the wonder of technology, and I've got some articles. Syria
Can you identify yourself, sir?
Sorry. My name is Fokian Zerpadakis. I'm a PhD student here and at UCL. And yeah, so some of the articles coming out. Syria's chemical weapons program was built. Oh, okay. France has proof, quote unquote, weapons were used. UN rights team believes chemical weapons were used. So maybe hopefully I'm not asking a repetitive question, but what's your position or your office's position?
Yeah. Let me say first that I mentioned laboratories designated earlier. We have a network of designated laboratories, 22 in different countries, and they go through a proficiency test every year to prove that they have the capability to analyze those samples which may be provided to them, and this is extremely important because we have standing arrangements with them in terms of confidentiality, preserving samples and so on. And we normally we would have sent those samples to 2 laboratories, and if there is a discrepancy about their findings, then a 3rd laboratory would be asked to analyze the same sample so that we can corroborate the findings. So that's how the system is functioning. Actually, we didn't have any experience yet in this respect, but it would have function in this way. In France, as I said earlier, France belongs to those countries which obtain some samples from certain sources, which we don't know how, and they analyze this sample in their laboratory, and they think that there are traces of chemical weapons and so on. The team that I mentioned earlier has been in contact with them. They were briefed, but as I said earlier, these findings cannot be actually used as an evidence because of the principle and procedural provision of chain of custody. My own view doesn't count much, but the official position we take is just the one that I mentioned. So we will actually hope that the team can reach some samples and some evidence and in fact conclude about the use or non-use of chemical weapons. There are other methods also, interviews of victims, interviews of health staff who may have treated those who are exposed to chemicals, video footages, and several other data. So they are in the process of collecting all this from different sources, but when it comes to samples, they didn't have any possibility to do it.
Okay.
Any other questions from anyone? I suspect some people might want to talk to you, Your Excellency, so thank you very, very much for